Hi everyone, and welcome to this webinar of the JoinHealth Autumn Series. This is a co-organization of the Health Cluster Portugal and the IT Health, herein represented by Miguel Amador. On today's webinar, you will hear about remote or decentralized clinical trials, which is a very hot topic today, and even more now after the emergence of the pandemic. And to share their experience and know-how on this topic, we will have today João Cerqueira, the Medical Executive Director of the Clinical Academic Center in Braga, Portugal. We will also have Freimut Lies from Profil, who will talk about the opportunities of remote decentralized clinical trials in clinical research, and Robin Marcus, the head of Decentralized Clinical Trials Enablement Services at LabCorp. So thank you so much for being here today and for sharing your knowledge with this audience. To let you know that after each presentation, we'll have time for questions from the audience. So everyone feel free to use the Q&A tool and ask your questions to the speakers. As usual, you can request the presentation slides by filling in the survey after the webinar, and you'll also be able to watch the replay of this session on the Health Cluster Portugal's YouTube channel. Moving without no further delays to the first presentation of this webinar by João Cerqueira. João Cerqueira is an associate professor at neurology at the School of Medicine, University of Minho in Braga, Portugal. He's also the head of neuroimmunology clinic at Hospital de Braga and the medical executive director of 2CA Braga, a clinical academic center fully devoted to clinical research and also the #1 site for clinical trials in Portugal. João is also a researcher, and his research focuses on determinants and treatment of poor cognitive function, particularly in neuroimmune disorders. His work has been funded by the Portuguese Science Foundation and by the European Union, Biogen, and also BIAL Foundation. Finally, is to let you know that he's also the president of the Portuguese Multiple Sclerosis Study Group. So, João, thank you very much for your presence here, and I will invite you to share your screen and start your presentation.
Thank you, Patricia. Thank you very much for your introduction and also for the invitation to be here. It's a pleasure. I will share my screen, and I will start without further delays, telling you that this is really a pleasure to present our experience. And of course, as Patricia said, we are a clinical trial site, and our experience with remote clinical trials was mostly driven by the pandemic. So during the pandemic hit us all, we went into lockdown and we had to reinvent ourselves and start doing some remote clinical trial visits. And this is the experience I am about to tell you. But before that, I'll just contextualize a little bit for you to understand what we did. And I'll tell you a little bit about who we are. So the Clinical Academic Center was created almost 10 years ago as a partnership. So it's a non-profit association that's a partnership between University of Minho and School of Medicine and the research institute that is associated with it, the ICVS, Hospital de Braga, which now is a public hospital, and a private hospital in nearby Porto, Hospital CUF. So these three partners came together and created 2CA with the mission to foster clinical research and translational research, and also train clinical research teams. And this is actually what we've been doing in the last 10 years. So we have a pretty large team for Portuguese standards now, and most of our team members are fully dedicated to clinical research. I'm the medical executive director, and I oversee the operations. And you see here that we have, from study coordinators to research nurses, technicians. We have the entire group of people that it's fully devoted to promote clinical research, mostly in Hospital Braga, but also in other centers. And then we have, of course, all the ancillary committees and services that are needed for our work. Since the beginning of the operations, as I told you almost 10 years ago, we've been steadily increasing the number of ongoing clinical studies. We have very good numbers of investigator-driven studies, but also industry-driven studies, as you can see. And this is something that we try to keep on pair. So we really want to foster also investigator-driven research, and we try to support our investigators and people that need our help to increase their role in clinical trials. We have several clinical studies, not only clinical trials as you see, but also many observational studies and studies of validation of medical devices. And in clinical trials, we have studies encompassing all phases of research. And I will highlight here that we also have phase 1 studies, which is really important for us, and just started this year, the first phase 1 studies. This is something that I will go back in a little bit later, but just to highlight that we have many participants in our studies. So we have in clinical trials almost 400 patients. And to highlight that there was an increase in the number of participants of ongoing studies from last year to this year, despite the pandemic. So despite all the problems in recruitment, in on-site visits, etc., we were still able to increase the number of participants, to recruit participants to our trials and other studies. And this was due in part to our approach using these remote clinical trial methodologies. We did televisits and things like that, and this allows us to keep our operations smoothly throughout the lockdowns and to increase the number of participants, to recruit more patients to our studies. We have two main key performance indicators regarding clinical trials. One is the recruitment rate, and it's just to show you that even during the pandemic, as you can see, and during the lockdowns, our recruitment rate was kept above 100%, which is our key performance indicator. And it's very close to 100%, even in those studies in which the recruitment is still open. So we really think these are very good numbers. And again, despite the pandemic, we could keep our performance on this indicator. The other one is the time to first patient in, so to the screening of the first patient in a trial after the initiation visit. And our indicator is set at 30 days. And as you can see, we are beyond that indicator in last year, but we have 67% of the trials that are below that indicator. So which is, I think, again, very good. And again, partly because we adapted our methodologies. And so now let's go back to last year, when on 26 March, we had this recommendation from the Portuguese health authorities regarding clinical trials, and they ordered us to halt all recruitment, all new recruitment for a while. We had to change our visits by using telemedicine. Monitoring was centralized. And so this came 2 weeks after we went into lockdown, and we had to adapt, of course. And what I'm going to tell you in the next 5 or 10 minutes is the adaptations we did and how we coped with that. And so this is the number of monthly visits that we had last year in 2020. And you see that the first lockdown in Portugal was between March and June. And we had, of course, a decrease in on-site subject visits, but not that much, because we were able to keep most of our visits, if not full on-site visits, at least visits for instance, infusions, some drug dispensing visits, and also some visits, abbreviated visits for instance, blood checks and other safety measurements. And so we, despite the lockdown and despite all the adaptations we had, we were able to keep a lot of on-site visits, but of course we had a reduction that was then catched up in the following months, as you can see, because also some visits were delayed. And this is what happened in the second lockdown, almost no change in on-site visits, a little reduction, but that was, again, catch up very easily. And we are now with more than 150 patient visits per month in our site. So what were the adaptations we had to do? Well, as I told you, we switched to telephone visits. We used a lot telemedicine. These were unfortunately not as good as we wanted, because we couldn't use, due to some regulatory constraints, video calls. The hospital didn't have in place the system to do that safely, so we had to stick to telephone visits, and 60% of our visits were changed to telephone visits. Of course, these were abbreviated visits because some procedures could not be performed on a telephone visit. We also simplified some visits. So, for instance, we had some visits only for blood collection that sometimes were only for safety reasons, or we did some safety visits for that during the lockdown. And then for infusions and other visits, special visits that needed to be done in the hospital, we could maintain that. So 40% of our visits were still on site. The other 60% that I told you were changed to telephone visits with sometimes some safety additional visits, for instance, for blood collection. We also developed, in collaboration with another association, that's the P5 Medical Center. So the P5 is a digital medical center that was created 3 years ago by the School of Medicine, and that provides telehealth services to the population. And in collaboration with the P5, we developed a protocol for nurse home visits. And in this case, during lockdown, the clinical trials nurse could visit the patient's home and do, for instance, blood withdrawals, drug dispensing, other assessments, without the patient having to come to the center. We proposed this to several CROs and promoters, but the timings of approvals made this solution not worthwhile during the lockdown. So we never used it. We got the interest from several promoters, but while we were negotiating all the protocol amendments, contracts, etc., regulatory authorizations, lockdown ended. Patients could return to the hospital again, so we never used it. But I will tell you a little bit more about that. So using on this offer that we still have in place, and we actually already tested with one promoter, the visits could be done by a dedicated nurse into the patient's home, and this would allow the collection of blood, the dispensing of drugs, the measurement of vital signs, and other parameters, EKG acquisitions, etc., ensuring the safety of the patient and the follow-up of the patient without any problems, even at the distance. And these could be negotiated with the promoter or the CRO. We could also use, as part of this service, the platform of the P5, which has a very well-established and approved safe platform for telehealth. We could use this platform to do the clinical visits by the team, the clinical trial team. So the physician, the investigators, and all the other assessors could do these assessments remotely with this platform, which has advantages regarding as compared with telephone visits. So we prepared this. We still haven't used it much, but it's available from now on, which is good. Now, we also had other issues that we faced in this remote setting. For instance, putting a new informed consent in place, for instance, for protocol amendments was a challenge. So many times we had to discuss this with the patients via telephone, but then we took note of this in the patient diary, but the implementation of the protocol amendment was only done when the patient signed this. Sometimes this was done by regular mail, by sending the consent and receiving it from the patient. Other times we had to wait until the next on-site visit to implement these changes. So this was a bit of a challenge, and it was not foreseen by the protocols of the trials. But we managed the best we could. Regarding the drug delivery, so we had most of our drugs delivered via courier. So most CROs and promoters had put this in place, and we used the service very well. We also did, for some patients, we did visits for drug dispensing only, so that we could minimize the time that the patient was in the hospital and be more flexible with the timings. And of course, the infusions visits we had to maintain, although we also foresaw the possibility of doing some of these at patient's home, but for regulatory reasons, we could not implement this. Regarding monitoring, which is also an important part of the conductance of any clinical trial, our study initiating visits and monitoring visits were done usually via video link, although for some selected visits, we also allowed on-site visits. Of course, because of the remote nature of the visits, there was more frequent telephone contacts between monitors and study coordinators and research team, and there was a longer response time to queries. And this was also because most of staff was working from home, so whenever they needed to check the patient diaries, they needed to be at the center, so this increased the time to respond to queries. But there was always a core team at the center every day to support the ongoing clinical activities. And this led to an increased burden for study coordinators that I think must be taken into consideration when looking for this kind of remote visits. This might lead to an increased burden for study coordinators due to the remote nature of the procedures. So as a summary, I think that remote visits are indeed possible for most clinical trials. I think that as with regular patient consultations, a dedicated platform with video link works best than a regular telephone consultation. Most routine clinical assessments can be done, although, for instance, physical examination obviously cannot. The collection of blood samples and other ancillary procedures, as I mentioned, can be done with home visits, and we provided that. And study drugs can also be sent to patients without problem safely, or be dispensed even at home visits by a nurse, for instance. As I also told you, remote monitoring visits also work well and can be done combined with on-site visits, and this is actually something that's not difficult given the adaptive nature of most monitoring protocols nowadays. There are some difficulties that I would like to highlight finally. First, not all assessments can be done remotely, and this often leads to the need to adapt the visits and might induce some protocol deviations. Bear in mind that patients like face-to-face interactions, so whenever possible, there should be periodic on-site visits, if not as frequent as in regular clinical trials, maybe at least once a year or something like that. And we still have, I think we don't have yet a good solution, at least in Portugal, for remote informed consent. I would like to see more progress on that, particularly from regulatory agencies. And please also bear in mind, at least in our case, we had an increased burden for study coordinators that has to be accommodated. And that's it. I'm waiting for your answers. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, João. So we have a couple of minutes for questions still. We thank you for this very interesting opportunity to hear from the experience from TUCA Braga. There is one question from the audience, from Joana Figueiredo. She asks about technology and the adoption of wearables to monitor patients remotely. She asks if you think this shift to virtual clinical trials will increase the adoption of these technologies, and if they could eventually replace some of the nurses' visits. What is your opinion?
Yeah, so we are also experimenting with that. So thank you, Joanna, for the question. I think that, yes, patient monitoring can also be done, actually, in sometimes can be better done by wearables than by seeing the patients regularly at the center. We have, for some conditions, already some validated measures that come from wearables that allow us to substitute this information for the regular visits that are usually done on site. The thing is that so we believe on this data, and we think this is a good way to replace some on-site visits. For instance, I would say for EKG acquisition, that's probably okay. At least for other vital signs, we have very good measurements. But for mobility, even for cognitive assessments, yes, we have good measures that can replace on-site assessments that can be done by wearables, smartphones, apps, whatever. But the thing is that most regulatory agencies, particularly in what regards safety measurements, they tend not to accept easily this. So most promoters tend to be cautious and prefer on-site assessments. But yes, I think that in the future we'll see more and more of these on-site safety assessments and also efficacy assessments be replaced by wearables. So what's happening now is that we are having in parallel the information coming from the wearables and from on-site visits with the idea to validate maybe the use of these wearables and to convince the regulatory agencies to accept this. And yes, I'd say in the near future, hopefully, we'll have the substitution of one by the other.
Thank you, João. So yeah, this is a very interesting question. I think we'll have time also to explore further this question during this session. Angela Papa also asks you about the experience with electronic informed consents from TUCA Braga in particular. Do you have any comment to add here?
No, and we had trouble. So I know that there are some initiatives in Portugal, particularly in the oncology field, to adopt this. As far as I know, we don't have any study in the center that use electronic informed consents, and I don't know exactly the details of the process. Maybe someone else knows, but as far as I know, we are not yet using this in Portugal, unfortunately. I know that abroad there are initiatives that use this, but unfortunately we are not yet using, as far as I know.
Okay, thank you very much. So we will now move to the next speaker. Thank you, João. Probably we'll have time for an open discussion in the end. So I will now pass on to Miguel, who will present our next speaker.
No, thank you, and it's a pleasure to have us here with us, Freimut from Profil, that is one of important partners of EIT Health from Germany, and Freimut himself is being a thought leader in this space of the centralized clinical trials, working in several projects even within EIT Health in this scope. He's the director of science and innovation of Profil. that works to advance and bring diabetes solutions into healthcare. So without further ado, I'll let Freimut to present and share his experience in this field.
Yes, thank you, Miguel, for this kind introduction, and hi, everybody. Yes, I'm from Profil, and this is a clinical contract research organization. So the company has been on the market for more than 20 years now, and we are specialized on clinical trials in the field of diabetes, obesity, cardiometabolic disease, and we have a clear focus on early phase clinical trials. I think this is a specific situation also in connection to the topic we would like to discuss today. Of course, so I try to move on with the slides. Of course, you can imagine that the pandemic also affected clinical research in Germany, and but I can say that fortunately, at least early phase pivotal clinical trials conducted in Germany usually did not have to be cancelled, as authorities recognized the need to continue clinical development programs, but also the high basic level of safety measurements maintained by hospitals, but also clinical contract research organization like ours. Nevertheless, we had to postpone some clinical trials, and there were some delays, and of course we had to implement additional precautionary measures to, in order to be compliant with the regulations given by the governmental bodies and the regulatory authorities, which included the implementation of hygiene and test conceptions. And in this context, we also started lots of discussions about remote decentralized clinical trials, and we found that we already worked partly with these elements, at least. And at the same time, we also found that the topic is much bigger than only discussing about measures how to realize clinical research under the conditions of a pandemic. So we think remote decentralized clinical trials, which are also referred to as virtual or web-based or hybrid clinical trials, of course, they have the advantage to can be realized without the need of visiting a medical facility. And as mentioned already during the discussion, it can be facilitated also by the increasing availability of variables to collect real-world physiological and behavioral data. Remote decentralized clinical trials is not a specific trial design. It's more a mode to do clinical trials. So both observational studies, but also randomized controlled clinical trials, which are still considered the golden standard in clinical research, can be conducted as remote decentralized clinical trials, or at least integrate some remote decentralized clinical trials elements. My favorite example in this field is the Apple Heart study, which was designed as an observational study to assess the suitability of a smartwatch program to identify people with atrial fibrillation. So just detecting signs and symptoms in a normally considered healthy population of clinical trial participants. And here the main activity was to download the study app and to onboard and enroll via the study app without any physical contact to a study site. And yes, you had to download the app. You could self-verify your eligibility for the clinical trial. You got presented the informed consent form via the app. You could sign digitally on the iPhone. Also, the completion of the demographic and medical history could be performed, and screening for atrial fibrillation via the smartwatch. And of course, there was also a 24-hour study hotline in order to be available for any unforeseen case. The main advantage in this study, and this is quite impressive, was the fast enrollment of more than 400,000 clinical trial participants, which was possible through emails, through social media activities, and so on. And this is something I think that you can really see that remote decentralized clinical trials can facilitate the conduct of large clinical trials, such as phase 3 or phase 4. Our company was involved in the so-called AP at Home study. We even coordinated this project, which was a Horizon 2020 project, which tested the feasibility of an artificial pancreas system, or also automated insulin delivery system, to support insulin therapy of people with type 1 diabetes at home. And an artificial pancreas is connecting continuous glucose monitoring and continuous subcutaneous insulin infusion via a control system which contains an algorithm, and the algorithm processes CGM data and at the end controls the activity of an insulin pump. And the goal of this clinical study, which we organized together with the Medical Center Amsterdam, was to find out whether it's safe and also effective for patients with type 1 diabetes to administer the insulin at home using an automated insulin delivery system. And this was a 12-week study, including 58 adults, but also children. And they performed their usual everyday activities under free living conditions. There was no continuous remote monitoring or supervision. Participants were completely free to choose their meals, which is quite important for people with diabetes, as you can imagine. And also in this case, there was access to a 24/7 helpline. And the data were transmitted automatically via a computer system. Another study, which we also conduct under the umbrella of EIT Health, is the so-called closed study. Also here you find the artificial pancreas system as part of the story, but it's here in this case it's a real-world study. It's connected to a French home care service provision facility driven by Air Liquide, and it's connected to health economic evaluation, to process evaluation, to quality control measures, and so on. So the topic is here not only about glycemic control, but also about saving costs, simplifying processes, and improving the quality of life of patients, but also of nurses and home care providers. And here we used the automated insulin delivery system in persons with type 2 diabetes, dependent on home care. And the study was conducted in the French home care service provision ecosystem at the crossroads between patients, health professionals, payers, prescribers, and telemedicine. So in this case, the remote design element of the study was inherent to the care environment we would like to investigate. It's home care. So the patient, the trial participant, had to stay at home almost by definition. And we also integrated trainings of healthcare provider here and also captured endpoints related to health, costs, and processes. The fourth example I would like to present you is a French analysis of a digital health product. It's a diabetes app called Diabio, which also brings data from the patient to an IT platform. The patient adds his or her insulin data, blood glucose control, nutritional data, and so on. There's some processing of the data, and the analytics is then made available to the diabetologist, who then can use this data later in a physical visit. And this analysis was also done in a quite remote, decentralized setting, because you see, it was a 12-month multi-center, double randomized open label study with more than 650 patients allocated to 95 test centers in France. And the main experience I would like to share here, you see here the green arm, which is the control situation. The pink arm is the situation where they receive the app. And the third is that they not only use the app, but also get some phone calls by nurses. And this physical element, it's not face-to-face, but this control element was quite important in order to increase the adherence of patients to using the app. Another topic which was already mentioned is indeed the availability of wearables and of medical devices which can be used for remote monitoring. This is a huge discussion about quality, about medical grades and being fit for purpose in the specific context of use. So I agree with Jean, who said that consumer grade wearables in clinical trials they might be used for the assessment of exploratory endpoints in the context of generating hypotheses, but for pivotal clinical research, which needs to be evaluated by the FDA or the EMA, we would go for medical grade wearables which are validated to be fit for purpose, for example, measuring heart rate variability and so on, in the specific context of use. And that could be clinical research in the field of cardiometabolic diseases, in the detection of heart failure or arrhythmia and so on. And context of use means also to be compliant with the requirements of FDA and EMA in regard to data transfer, in regard to validation of the data transfer, and so on. So this is a specific thing, and I think we need more and more devices for remote monitoring, which are specifically designed for clinical research. And this is why Profil is coordinating the Real World for Clinic project, which is another EIT Health supported innovation project. We do this together with a French startup, with Sentin Health, with several academic centers, with the Fraunhofer Institute from Germany, but also with an institute specialized in health economic modeling and so on. And this is a device specifically designed for real-world cardiorespiratory health monitoring for clinical contract research, but also later on for telecardiology. And this project, as I mentioned, supported by EIT Health, will accelerate the market launch of this device for clinical research and telecardiology. And you don't need only the device, you need also some communication platform in order to get some data transfer, but also to have some interaction with the patient who is wearing the device. And you also need some personal data lifecycle management. And all of this is also part of this EIT Health funded Real World for Clinic project. So during the EIT Health funded phase, which ends at the end next year, we would like to achieve CE mark application, create the condition for scalability from drug development, which is our preferred first market, our initial market, or the stepping stone to then outpatient cardiology. So I would like to discuss a little bit what are the opportunities, limitations of RDCTs, and I would say a large opportunity is that a remote decentralized clinical trial can democratize the access to clinical trials by approaching difficult to reach population groups, because you don't have to be physically present at the clinical trial site. You can achieve more diversity and greater proximity to real-world treatment effect modifiers, so real-world situations at home, which again improve external validity of trial outcomes and inform sponsors about early adaptations in trial design and targeted patient groups. So you get much more information by continuous data monitoring under real-world conditions as part of a clinical study. And of course, you can achieve a reduction in the number of study centers and physical visits, which helps to increase cost effectiveness and also sustainability. Another opportunity we see is the implementation of study apps, which we have not yet realized at our company, could facilitate online registration, communication with the study team, recruitment, e-consent, adherence to clinical trial protocol, virtual visits, and so on. And all of this has been nicely shown very early already in the Apple Heart study. What are the limitations? So in our setting, where we are going to do early phase clinical studies, which often are first in human, first in patient, dose finding studies or mechanistic studies, in-person visits are still required. In exploratory or proof of concept studies with provocation tests, it means, for example, artificially establishing hypoglycemic situations in clinical trial participants, you have to be in a clinical research unit, which is very well supervised, and more technically demanding procedures also need to be done face-to-face by trained personnel. Another aspect is the app fatigue, which may affect engagement, protocol adherence, completeness of follow-up, and also reliance on reported outcomes. And of course, you always have some bias due to the preferred inclusion of technology-oriented trial participants. And high-speed internet is not yet available area-wide, which would be required. Our conclusion is that the strength of remote decentralized clinical trials may depend on the overall objective and the disease and intervention to be investigated. And special attention should be drawn to inclusion and exclusion criteria, to the expected sample size, to the invasiveness of intervention and assessment procedures, safety, tolerability profile of the investigational drug or device, and also the availability of fit-for-purpose remote monitoring devices which are validated for clinical research. And of course, you should not miss implementing also training, motivational, and feedback tools. So in perspective, we think in late phase and post-market clinical follow-up studies, remote decentralized clinical trials will make a real difference by increasing diversity of trial volunteers and also the simplification of data acquisition and clinical trial operations. In early phase clinical trials, we think we can facilitate clinical trial operations and improving external validity of trial outcomes by an integration of real-world data and patient-reported outcomes. And this includes, of course, also remote decentralized clinical trial elements. So we combine the best of two worlds. And further research should investigate the potential of these studies to improve the sustainability and ecological footprint in clinical research. And here I would like to stop and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Freimut. We'll have now a couple of minutes for questions from the audience or from the other speakers. I'm not sure there are some questions already. So I can start. So you mentioned the advantage of using the study apps and also the use of wearables and other devices in clinical trials and trials in general. But what about the challenges? I mean, you mentioned it about the use in, for instance, in remote geographical areas. But do we have, for instance, let's say for less tech-savvy populations like the elderly, are they prepared to use some of this technology? What should we do to improve digital literacy and also health literacy in these populations? And how can this be a challenge for this kind of implementation for these populations?
Yes, your question indicates that it's a big topic. It's not just a short-term measure to manage the pandemic. That's a nice thing. So the pandemic initiated thinking about this, but it's not yet here. It's not yet there. So the RDCT trials are not yet, at least in our environment, not yet reality. we just start thinking about. And you address many important things. Of course, for me, it's clear that the continuous monitoring of clinical trial participants, even in case they participate in a traditional clinical trial setting, brings lots of additional information about the real-world safety and tolerability of a new drug, of new investigational compound. And when you can, the sponsor gets much earlier critical information of whether he should continue his development or not. So additional information, better quality for decision-making, and at the end, of course, saving of considerable amounts of costs. So, but the prerequisite of this is that you have high quality medical devices, which you can use as sensor systems, which are comfortable, which will be used, which cannot be removed from the body. So there's lots of developmental work in order to optimize the available tools. But of course, some consumer-grade wearables are a very good starting point to enter into this field. The second thing is indeed, if you would like to analyze primary endpoints, which are critical for the approval of a drug, then it will be difficult. Then you need acceptance by the regulatory authorities, not only of the quality of the device, but also of the management of the data by the device. So how it's documented, how it can be audited, what is the data lifecycle management, and so on. And you mentioned also the digital literacy. Of course, it's important also to do clinical trials with elderly people or the people who are on polypharmaceutical treatments, which are almost excluded from current clinical trials. And here is lots of developmental work and lots of education, training, also marketing, in order to bring this to the attention of authorities and also the target groups, which at the end should benefit most from the clinical research.
Yeah, thank you very much. So and also on this topic, you mentioned some of the challenges are also on the side of the trial side. So, for instance, how can they or should they manage data and privacy of the data that is being collected using these new technological devices? And João has also mentioned that during his presentation. How can this pose an extra burden on trial sites? So there are a lot of advantages, but are certainly challenges that have also arisen from implementing this kind of decentralized clinical trials in trial sites and also on CROs. Can you comment a little bit on these?
Yes, I think basically there are two aspects. Of course, you can consider that doing remote decentralized clinical trials could save some costs in trials operations. But if you only consider this trial opportunity under the cost-saving aspect, it's not covering all aspects. I think initially it will be also some investment to have the technologies available, to have the tools available to do this remote monitoring and to do it in a way which is accepted during inspections by the FDA and by the European Medicines Agency. And so it's not a cheap way to do clinical trials. That's for sure. It's not a cheap way to do clinical trials. It's quite challenging, and you need really expertise as from the people who are on the table here in order to do it in a qualified and acceptable and also meaningful way. So it's not an easy thing.
Okay, so and just a final question. And what about the projects that you mentioned? I believe they're all in place right now. So what is the feedback that you get from the trial participants? What is your feeling comparing to the regular way of doing clinical trials?
Yes, I can mention the AP at home trial, which was conducted in earlier than 2015. So it was not named remote decentralized clinical trial, but it involved lots of elements of this kind of studies. And the patients were quite happy with it. They felt very comfortable in their at-home environment. they felt very much supported by the technology, because type 1 diabetes is quite tricky in terms of insulin injections and so on. So there was lots of relief. And at the end of the trial, many of the participants wanted to keep the device at home and use it further, which was, of course, not possible, unfortunately. And today, this kind of devices are available in the market. But at that time, it was a great experience to see that the participants really enjoyed doing this kind of study, and also intended to continue using the devices.
Okay, thank you very much. So I think we'll end by now with this positive tone of the conversation, and we will move forward. Thank you very much, Freimut, for your answers and for sharing your experience in DCTs. And we will now move forward to Robin, who is the head of Decentralized Clinical Trials Enablement Services at LabCorp. She has over 30 years of industry experience focused on operationalizing new products and services, including medical software, innovative lab services, and disease-specific programs. She has spent the past 10 years focusing on developing new strategic relationships and working collaboratively with sponsors to implement patient-centric services in their study protocols. She's originally an oncology and bone marrow transplant nurse, where she applied her knowledge to caring for complex patients at home across all therapeutic areas, age ranges, and geographies. She was also the Chief Strategic Officer at Global Care Clinical Trials before their acquisition by LabCorp in 2020. So thank you so much, Robin, and the screen is yours.
Thank you so much. I feel quite privileged to follow the other presenters and hopefully offer maybe a bit of a different perspective as well. Let's see, maybe we will go advancing. There we go. This is me with shorter hair and blonde before the pandemic. And, you know, the current state of the industry, I feel that we have to remember that we're in an ocean, right? That the tide is always changing and the currents are changing. Sometimes you're in very smooth water and sometimes it's rather turbulent. And that's an important consideration because, you know, it is much more prevalent now that we're thinking about remote offerings to support clinical trials. But actually, it's been around a very long time. I was quite fortunate to have actually participated in supporting what we believe to be the very first clinical trial. This was in 1992 that used home visits. And I was the director of nursing at a home care company in California, where we were asked to see schizophrenic patients who had not been returning to the sites for their safety labs. And the individual, there was one person who actually had the thought of saying, we've got to solve this problem as to why patients are not coming back for the safety labs. Well, they knew why. With schizophrenic patients, they started feeling good because they were taking their medication. And why would they go back to the site if they were feeling good? You stay away from the doctor when you're feeling good. And that's, you know, what you're experiencing in life, right? With schizophrenia. And so this is where she said, our company has a home care portion. I'm going to reach out to them and see if they can see these patients. And that's how it all began. And luckily, that same person, Gail Adenomus, was the founder of Global Care Clinical Trials, where I became the Chief Strategy Officer 20 years later from that very first trial that we supported. We have a tremendous dropout rate across clinical trials, right? 30% on average. 80% of trials don't meet their enrollment timelines. And 50% of sites enroll either no patients or one patient. That's a hefty price to pay for the site as well, to go through that setup and that training and never enroll a patient. And of course, for the sponsor. And due to COVID, 49% of studies reported slow enrollment, 35% of studies suspended enrollment, and 16% of studies delayed initiation altogether. The opportunity also, though, we've got incredible, besides just challenges, we've got opportunity. We have patients who are more informed now. They're utilizing mobile technologies, and they have articulated through several surveys that they're 50% more likely to participate if mobile technologies were offered. 69% of clinicians are using mobile technologies to view patient information, and 80% of doctors are using smartphones and medical apps. There's also a need to increase diversity in clinical trials. So with it's almost a 400% increase in the number of clinical trials from 2009 to 2019, attracting, retaining patients is a critical success factor. We've got to solve for that problem. And we need to take into account the burden on the patient and on the sites in order to be able to handle this increase. When you think about either DCTs, decentralized trials, whatever you want to call them, most people think about technology. And I love that the previous two speakers really talked about that human touch side of it as well, which is the home visits, telemedicine, even though it's relying on a technology, it's still a person enabled, right? It's a service with a high touch. And I would say that most people's brain on DCT, decentralized clinical trial, probably looks a bit mumbo jumbo like this, where we're trying to put different applications, different technologies, different companies into buckets about what they do. And I think it's still missing the overall, though, point about which comes back to the genesis of why we do any remote work when we have typically been a brick and mortar industry. And I would argue that the reason that we do this is because trials should be designed around the patients. And both the previous speakers articulated this as well, taking into account the patient's actual lifestyle. And so DCT, decentralized clinical trials or remote trials, it's more than technology. It is a mindset. It is a way of thinking and incorporating the right things into the fabric of a clinical trial to make it easier for patients to participate, easier for sites. It is more efficient, and that we get a window into what's really happening with patients. So I would argue that it's a very patient-centric approach to conducting clinical trials, which focuses on optimizing the patient's experience by considering their health condition, their lifestyle, demographic considerations, even to the point of also, though, their community and caregivers and support system. Just coming back to those schizophrenic patients where we were seeing them, tracking them down in Golden Gate Park or at a halfway house, that it is centered around where that patient is and making sure that then you can meet them safely and without jeopardizing endpoints. As a matter of fact, actually ensuring endpoints. So how do you leverage technology, clinical services that optimize the patient experience and actually consider them upfront rather than what we experienced with COVID for so many, which was retrofitting it in, which is a really hard thing to do. Just as the first speaker had talked about, you're up against a time frame then. But if you pre-plan and you really construct the trial around, well, we know what patients like this do, you will create a trial designed around them with options on what will be done, because not every patient will want telemedicine visits. They may want to come to the site if available. So thinking about what your measures are, what your outcomes are, what you're going for, your endpoints, and though creating a trial design that is flexible and accommodating to patients and their families. And I think there's nothing that kind of a picture paints 1,000 words. The traditional model is a very episodic way also of gathering data and information, and even an understanding of what's happening to participants, that we're gathering data at specific time points and only at those time points. Before there were electronic patient-reported outcomes, right, e-diaries and things like that, we were asking for paper diaries. And it got proven that most of those paper diaries are getting filled out on the way to that visit, or in the parking structure, on the metro, on their way to that visit. And so is that data reliable? Are we really getting a window into what's happening? And with a patient-centric model, we're getting a much more holistic view of what's really happening with patients. I think what we learned from Profil was, right, that measurement, whether it is blood glucose, whether it is their, their activity level, that having that has value, and has value to the provider to then intervene as well. And so this is tremendous for everyone involved, because the other thing is, if you're given two options, it's a very competitive landscape as well. And I've got 2 diabetes trials, one where the majority of the time I'm carrying on my normal daily living, and I can have a clinician or someone come and see me to draw labs or to adjust medication, etc., versus going here for every visit. Which one are you going to choose? Which one would you want your loved one to choose? And if we have a goal, which I hope that we do, of having clinical trials as a care option rather than the last resort, then we need to make it easier for people to participate, which levels the playing field as well for more diversity, and also then getting a true window into what it is like for them, being able to gather that feedback, even input as you're developing and designing the ePro. Might have diabetic retinopathy and not be able to see screens as well. Therefore, what accommodations have been made for that patient population who could have that. All of these things are so important. Now, we look at remote or decentralized clinical trials in a variety of ways, always with the patient at the center, and looking at ways that we can ease use, allow for real-time interaction, be more engaging, get direct source data, which is then hopefully accurate, more accurate than paper. And if we can automate workflows so that we can conduct more trials where, let's say, comprehensive visits are done at the site with some of the visits then happening remotely, or certain things that happened at visits so that the visit time is less, then this is good for everybody as well. And so we look at both site and patient services and applications. And we know that there's a continuum or a spectrum in conducting remote trials. This is one that I love speaking about, which is this notion of e-consent. And most of the time you hear e-consent and you think remote consenting of patients. And there are the challenges that have been brought up with regards to is it accepted by regulatory authorities? Even if you do it electronically, does it then do you need a wedding signature? All kinds of things like that. I actually don't think of e-consent as remote consenting. I think of e-consent in moving from paper to glass, because isn't it worthwhile for us as an industry to move to electronic capture of consenting? It's a huge issue, as we know, with the data and the tracking, and this solves a huge burden and something that often delays study closeout. There are findings on, and so working with the regulatory authorities, working with IRBs, et cetera, to institute then a technology that helps to solve that behooves us all, and is very much akin from when we moved to paper, what I want to say, paper everything to eTMF, or even any type of electronic medical records, right? And then you've got the full spectrum of things, all the way to 100% virtual, meaning there is no site or there's a investigator per country or area that is overseeing, reviewing data, may be needed for consenting, etc., but that it's siteless, so to speak. And I think we're a ways from getting here, that really most things fall into hybrid. And as was pointed out, I think depending on the protocol, the phase, the patient population, etc., it is highly individualized and specific. We've supported many phase 1 studies in a way that maybe is not first of mind, but sometimes it's during the screening process, finding the right people, or in the latter time point PK draws, rather than keeping them at the facility, allowing them to go, and then for those latter time point PK draws or other lab tests, being able to draw those remotely. Therefore, you can see more patients and meet your study parameters sooner, or endpoints. So I want to talk about a couple of case studies, and it's interesting because although I'm going to talk about COVID for a couple of them, I do want to talk though about this idea of continuity of care and proactively considering how you mitigate risk in a trial and what you should put in so that you're not up against a time frame where then you can't implement something that you know would help with the safety of patients or sites, etc. And because this model of remote trials that we were supporting at Global Care had been around for so long, we had already a couple hundred studies and thousands of patients who could not miss a beat, no matter what country. Italy was actually one of the first places we got asked to do a lot of visits for new patients for studies that we were supporting whose sites previously weren't interested in utilizing the service, but then could easily, with a phone call or an email, reach out to us and have us see patients because it was in place already. And it's sponsored, paid for. So the first case study that I wanted to review is one that is in pediatric neuromuscular. And this is a phase 2 rare disease with over 350 patients. We had been supporting and part of this study for actually several years prior to COVID. And we were engaged in 20 countries. This sponsor did an amazing job with this rare disease, oftentimes having visas for patients' families, relocating them near a center of excellence so that they could be seen. And because of that, our services weren't needed as much as they thought they would. We did have patients who, after, let's say, the first part of the study, then went and relocated, even if it was in the country, just not so close to the center, maybe with another family, extended family, or moved back to their country of origin, and we would see then. But what was important is we were already closely connected to understand the needs of this patient population, their families, the sites, even though we hadn't been utilized heavily before COVID. And so and I'm sorry, I'm having to move this around a little bit. What ended up happening is that it became difficult or dangerous to get to the investigator sites. And that, as I described, many of the participants were treated in different regions from where they even lived. So going back to the site wasn't even an option, but they could not be dropped from the trial, and there was a concern of safety. There was a need for ongoing treatment and a danger of severe effects from discontinuing if they discontinued from the trial. So also, we understood that the courier services that were often used with these patients were also experiencing delays, and that we may need to step in to help solve some of those delays, because we couldn't just leave it up to the normal transport of things, right? Not as many planes flying, not the ability to move things around the way that they had previously been done. So site visits were often replaced with home-based visits, including medication administration, drawing labs. We use portable centrifuges, and weighing patients, which was really important for dosage calculations. So it took a lot of coordination between the sites and the clinicians that went out to see these individuals. And oftentimes, even if it were allowed, then getting the PI on the phone while we were visiting these patients. Some of the actions that we ended up taking were, first of all, we could engage in all 20 countries in a matter of weeks. Again, kudos to the sponsor for knowing this patient population and getting feedback from them, even with the very first protocol design, to know that they always wanted home care and the remote ability to be an option there. For many patients, we were doing, so it was already built in to the informed consent. It was already built into the protocol very easily by just saying that the PI and patient had the option for remote visits as appropriate and safe, deemed safe. And so it really allowed for that flexibility from the get-go. So we were seeing a lot of these patients all before the end of March. And we have in-country coordinators for any country that we're supporting a clinical trial in. And those country coordinators are typically physicians or research nurses as well. So they're speaking local language with both the people at the sites, or if they're working remotely, and also speaking the language of the patient, which is important as well. They were already trained on the trial specifics. We already had that, and that's really important too. So what we offer by being able to service over 60 countries around the world in this way is that standardization and training so that it's always done the same way and at the same quality. This also takes some burden off the site for, we were hearing initially like how setting up those services was so challenging, and then it would have been the burden of the site to have to train them, etc. And this way, the sponsors already signed off on board. The sites have been trained on what to do if they want to utilize these services and can activate them. And it doesn't put all the pressure on the sites to do this. So we also could do forecasting on the supply chain, work with the couriers that had typically been in place to mitigate any disruptions. So it helps being a partner from the beginning, even if the services aren't utilized until they're needed, and that's okay. The results, and this is what I love, is that, again, that proactive partnership definitely makes sense. Pediatrics, pretty much a kind of, I feel like it's a no-brainer, but I guess for some people it still may be a struggle. Over 17 months, more than 220 home visits occurred, assisting 130 patients in 12 countries. So there was a strong acceptance of the model, and the sponsor loved it, the patients loved it, the sites loved it, because there wasn't this huge impact that could have really been catastrophic for this patient population with COVID-19. Really, we're so thankful for having this in place for so long. And so we service 39% of the patients, and 67% of the countries utilized those services. I've got one more I'm going to put up, because I think what's interesting is there's dermatology indication. This is a case study for dermatology. It's actually been published, so you can read up on that if you so desire. And it's really a partnership between the mobile application, photography, and home visits. And so it used televisits to reduce the study burden, a mobile application for eCOA and ePro, and then remote sampling from home visits. And also LabCorp has something unique in the US, which is patient service centers, where patients can go in their community and have their labs drawn, and then those go back to the central lab when LabCorp is the central lab. So what used to be called Covance Central Lab, and now rebranded. With that, I want to, I know we're coming near to the end, and I want to pause and see if there are questions or comments, threats. I'm happy to address all of them.
Thank you very much, Robin. We don't have questions from the audience so far. I have a couple of them, and I think Miguel also has some questions. I'm not sure if you still have some more slides to present.
I have one more case study that I'll just quickly show, but if you want the, I have provided these slides to Patricia, and she's happy to send them out afterwards as well. It's in a rare disease. It is an enzyme replacement therapy, And this just goes through, and this was all, again, pre-COVID. So these are 6 studies, everything from phase 1 through phase 3, have supported over 140 patients in 12 countries over 5 years and conducted more than 5,000 visits. These patients are getting IV infusions lasting several hours. And without this service, these patients would not participate in the trial because it's enzyme replacement. This is going to be an ongoing treatment for them, and it's not an option to go back. Now, these trials were designed so that when they're initially getting the replacement therapy, they are on site until they're stable and the site deems that it's safe that this therapy can be given at home. They can, and they did utilize home visits, even at the initiation or screening for blood draws. And that really helped also the sites become more efficient at finding the patients that qualified and would benefit for this. So I just wanted to kind of give that framework. This is unique because it was using central pharmacy services, but there are lots of options. It's very important that there is a community that you're really taking into consideration what the patients will need and what they're willing to do and want to do. So a good trial is designed actually to improve the communication and relationship with the site. And that's one thing that we look to do with every study that we support as well. So we don't try to replace the site. We actually try to be an extension, in a sense, of their caring and their services into that patient's community and home.
Thank you very much, Robin. So I think we have now time for a couple of questions from the audience.
And meanwhile, if I can start, probably this is a profound question, but probably for a quick discussion in some way. The clinical trial is much more than simply a drug. In the end, it's like how people take it, all the procedure. And when we move to use digital tools for clinical trials, are we actually meaning that for the actual treatments, these digital tools will become part of the therapy or of the procedure? And if that's the case you are seeing now, and we'll actually see this as a way of opening the door to more combination between digital tools and traditional pharmaceuticals. Primate, I don't know if you.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And I think that you all with Profil are at the forefront of this, because diabetes for so long has relied on and embraced, I think, technology in the ongoing treatment, or devices in the ongoing monitoring and treatment with patients. And I think it's consumerism. I mean, we've got to take into account what people really want. And they're using their mobile devices, right? And they're using technology to make it easier in something where there's a huge lifestyle implication. And so we need to consider how devices, is it something temporary, or is it drug device combination? We've supported some Parkinson's studies that are drug device combination, and relied on an ongoing device to help with the monitoring, actually, and administration of the medication. So I don't know if that answers it, but I think you're spot on, and that we really do need to consider it from what patients want. And that voice of the patient is so, so important.
Yes.
Primate, you want to add something?
Yeah, Yeah, I very much enjoyed your talk, Robin, and I would like to refer to your great statement, considering that clinical trials can also be considered as a care option. And I enjoy it very much because I also think that clinical research and clinical care should somehow converge. It's clear there are different regulatory spheres. But especially in case we have a look on value-based healthcare settings, it makes little sense to do clinical research completely outside the care reality, and vice versa. I do think that clinical research can also somehow inspire the provision of clinical care by adding this consumerism aspect, which you mentioned very nicely. Just as a comment.
Thank you very much, Freimut. Miguel, do you have any further questions? Yeah, so I just have a question slash comment about, and it's somehow related to this final discussion about if, do you think there are specific clinical areas which may benefit more of implementing these remote components? I mean, you mentioned the schizophrenia example, and now we are talking about also the role of having the medical devices and the wearables also as a treatment combination with drugs. Do you think there are these specific settings where this remote components may add or help the recruitment, the retention of patients? And I would say, for instance, for psychiatric disorders, this may be the case, or even for rare diseases that you mentioned as one of your case studies. So I think this is an open question for all of you. I don't know if anyone wants to comment.
I know that for me, I look at it as I start with understanding what life may be like for that patient and talking to those patients and advocacy groups, etc., to understand what it is. And then from there, I think you can create that patient journey, knowing that every patient's not on the same journey, right? And I speak from that for an oncology nurse, but with any disease, we don't know the trajectory, the timing, etc. And therefore, I think when you start with that frame of mind, it's easier to pull in the pieces that could have a benefit along that journey. Rather than, when we're talking about digital devices, a lot of what we're talking about is how to more maybe accurately get to an endpoint or decrease the footprint or the burden on the patients on the sites. And I think you got to make sure that you've got that voice of the patient, of the participant in it to combat. Sometimes we get so scientific around the study that we forget what it's really going to be like. I loved just last week speaking with a sponsor about their malaria study and the areas that they were going to need to go to get the patients and make a difference with this was such that, you really had to think outside the box to how it would make it so easy and be acceptable culturally for these people to participate in the trial. We're talking about remote Africa, possibly Bangladesh, and this is reality, and how are you going to make that feasible? So all those kind of, like I say, that the water is always shifting, and it depends where you're at in the ocean too, to know what the tide will do and where you may bump into some unforeseen rocks. that you may want to avoid, try to avoid.
Yeah, João, I don't know if you want to comment further.
Yeah, so I think that, of course, the participant should be in the center of it, and I would highlight this sentence from Robin. I like that slide with the patient, the photograph of the patient, because I think we have to go into that direction, and sometimes we forget that the patient is at the center of everything we do. But I think that there are some populations that clearly can benefit of this. In our experience, for instance, pediatric populations benefit very much from having remote visits because they don't miss school and it's less invasive for them. And even, for instance, having blood withdrawal at home, it's very different from having it at the center. So in general terms, I would say that, for instance, pediatric populations are populations that would benefit most from these remote technologies. Also people with rare diseases, but here it's a little bit not because of the patient, but because of the easiness of recruitment. So it's much easier to recruit patients from distant locations when you have remote trials. And so, for instance, when you don't have enough population at your center, it might be interesting to have this ability to do remote visits, and this would allow you to recruit patients that live far away there, even if they don't, because they don't need to come to your center. So these are two areas in which I think we should invest more, maybe in these remote technologies, because this will allow us to improve recruitment and make life easier for patients and also for the centers.
Okay, thank you. Thank you all. So if no one has any further questions or comments, we'll end this session. And once again, by thanking João, Freimut, and Robin for sharing their know-how with us and also their experience. It was a really great session on the challenges and opportunities for this decentralized and remote clinical trials. And I think how they may help us move clinical research into a more patient-centered approach. So just before we finish, I would like also to thank the attendees for being with us this afternoon. And I invite you to follow the updates on the program of this series online in our website. You can use the QR code on the screen for that. And also you may follow the Health Cluster Portugal and the IT Health through the social networks and know more about these and other activities. Next week, we will have a workshop on electronic health records. So if you want to join us, you may do your registration online. So I hope to see you there and have a nice week. Goodbye.